the 2000 ISIL in Iraq and potentially Syria. Many feel the president's proposed AUMF is too broad, and any new AUMF must include the repeal of the 2001 and 2002 AUMFs. Senate and Affairs committees are conducting hearings on the AUMF as we speak. The CPC has repeatedly argued that Congress has the constitutional duty to robustly debate and vote on use of force against ISIL. Representative Lee's office has taken the lead on this effort and authored a bill calling for a comprehensive solution to the crisis. Representative Lee should be here shortly, and while we are waiting on her, I'm joined by two colleagues of mine, Jan Schakowsky from Illinois and Sheila Jackson Lee from Texas. We have witnesses here at the table who have given up their time to come and brief us with their perspectives on this particular issue. And I do not know if we want to call for statements from...
Yeah.
Okay, so at this time, I believe, who's got seniority?
Well, Jan can't. Yeah.
Okay, well, I've got the mic. I think we'll go with seniority, and I think that Jan Schakowsky or Sheila Jackson Lee has seniority. We'll start with Sheila Jackson Lee.
Well, we have a number of schemes here. It's who came, the gentleman from Georgia, and I thank the gentlelady from Illinois for their kindness in yielding on this very important hearing, and I thank the co-chairs and particularly Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who has initiated a initiative. I have a lot of papers here, but let me speak from the heart and indicate that I may depart not purposely, but because of overlapping responsibilities. I think this is a very important hearing, and I call back to, if I might, memory lane as we entered into both the Afghan and Iraq wars. I remember my proudest moment was looking down 57th Street, I think, the privilege of speaking to those who oppose the war. It's a very cold, cold, cold day, and I see someone smiling who have people came from all over the country. Standing in the snow here, so compelled to do a press conference, and I think it was when a lot of members had gone home and I got terrible bout of the flu. But it showed the front. I hope that we have a vigorous debate. I am troubled because of a number of points, and I will conclude. I'm troubled because the sounds are historical sounds. Some would say hysterical, but they're historical. They were the sounds of President John F. Kennedy when we had technocrats and experts and advisors, that's a very famous word, advisors who were on the ground in Vietnam. And ultimately, a president decided not to run for the second term because of the enormity of the Vietnam War. Dead plus, many of us knew of those persons. Again, we have a circumstance where individuals are characterizing this, and let me thank the administration for attempting to work as closely to the margin of face. But there's a balance in sunset given someone else. And so it's very difficult to restrain war. And what we have, the concept of advisors again, and technocrats and special forces, and that is boots on the ground. And I heard this, I closed. This should not be an ego matter for states. This should be a matter of young men and women who never question when them or when they put on the uniform and we send them forward. Them question. But they come home either in body bags, home 165,000 suffering from something called PTSD, or dog, of which all of us are committed to giving. But we will get into debate, I think a foolish debate. Iran has boots on the ground, and they're getting more authority than we're getting. Democracy is authority. Values are authority. And I'd much rather win the hearts and souls of Iranians and Iraqis on the basis of our values, not who's over in the fight, and we need to get into the fight. I'm not jealous of them. I want us to have a constructive response. And I am fearful of those resonating sounds that it's just a few on the beat. It's just a few on the ground. And so I as I listen to you for a moment, I thank the chairman who is here. I know that your testimony will be instructive. We need to be constructive and instructive, and I am committed to saving lives. And ISIL is fearsome, and I believe there are many ways of fighting ISIL and ISIL, and many of those ways involve the resounding, thunderous sound of boots on the ground, young men and women that will now enter into another 10 and 20-year war. I've had enough of it. I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Jackson Lee. And now, word from Jan Schakowsky of Illinois.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the panel. I want to leave most of the time to you. But let me just say, Ms. Bennis, we've never met before, but I'm watching you on television that while all the politics was swirling around Iranian agreement and the visit of the Prime Minister, you continually focused on whether or not, what were the consequences of a negotiated agreement. And I thought that was really important to get to the real essence of what mattered. Here's my just kind of back of envelope concerns about the AUMF. I think we need a new one. I think the fact that it sunsets and that it provides enduring ground combat, those, at least those ideas are good ones. I guess my biggest problem is I can't understand why we keep the 2001 AUMF, which is that broad AUMF, pretty much of everything. It seems contradictory to me. If the idea is to narrow, then why keep the broad? And so, if any of you can help fill me in on what is the meaning of that, or at least what potentially are the consequences of maintaining that, I would appreciate it. And I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman Schakowsky. And we've just been joined by Congressman Honda. You ready to go, or you want to you need a minute to get it together?
Much for convening this forum, and welcome to the panelists. Said that the U.S. is on the brink of wading into another yet endless ground war in the Middle East, and we've spent a bunch of money and lost thousands of American lives and combating extremism, and we seem to we're set up to be doing it once again. And I really want to see us change that narrative, and so I'm looking forward to hearing your comments, and I'm proud to have worked with many of the members here with Barbara Lee in introducing the comprehensive solution to ISIL resolution and to some sane, mature approach to solving some of this conflicts. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And Congressman Hank Johnson, Stafford, made your opening statement yet? I guess I was wrong about that, but I would like to invite you right now to offer your views before we introduce the panel.
Certainly. Good afternoon, everyone. I am glad that President in office. President Obama got into office largely because of opposition to in Iraq. The invasion of Iraq, big boondoggle about it, and it's led us to the conflicts that we are dealing with today. And during the time that President Obama has been in office, he has largely gotten us out of Iraq. we probably would have stayed in with some higher or some degree of troop strength if we had been able to reach a status of forces agreement with that country. But because there was not a will on the part of the Iraqi government to enter in such an agreement that would shield U.S. troops from Iraq domestic law, then the decision was made, and it was the right decision to withdraw all of our forces from. Did that, we saw the work that had to constitute an Iraqi army fall apart. And then as a result of that, you had a vacuum into which, but it's not his fault. He did exactly what needed to be done, while in the process of closing out the war as we knew it in Afghanistan after a surge that was caused by a number of civilian people influencing the politicians here in Washington and made it almost impossible for the president to avoid a escalation. So it was escalated. He set a deadline as far as when it was going to de-escalate. He abided that deadline. Troops have come home. We still have issue in Afghanistan with the Taliban, and you know, I mean, it is what it is. We can either leave and leave the place like Iraq, leaving it totally on its own, or we can leave a small force of under 10,000 people is what is being recommended now to aid and assist the Afghans on the ground. And then meanwhile, we have the ISIL issue popping off. What do we do? Do we do nothing, or do we send in ground troops? Hell no. Do we support other nations, even the nation of Iran, as it seeks to confront the ISIL threat? Do we assist them in handling it themselves and then provide some air cover? Certainly, that is a reasonable manner of proceeding in my view. And does it have to have congressional approval? Does that conflict rise to the level of a war? What is war? And does our limited engagement require a declaration of war, which only Congress can do in accordance with Article 1, Section 811 of the U.S. Constitution? Only Congress can declare war. But in Article 2, Section 1, the president is granted the power as commander-in-chief. In my view, to have that power has some inherent characteristics to it, which means you can use the military power, congressional authorization. In my view, I think historically that is the view that has been utilized by executives to defend this country. And so I recognize the fact that an AUMF, although it is a good have, is not constitutionally required, nor does this conflict reach the level of a war. Granted, I don't know I can't define for you what war is. War is hell, though, and I think conflict is hell, too. So having said that, I look forward to hearing from the panelists their views on all of these issues.
Thank you, and I want to thank my colleagues for joining us today, and I also particularly want to thank Congresswoman Barbara Lee for leading the Peace and Security team and organizing this forum. She's been detained unexpectedly, and we're going to wish her the best in sorting out what's detaining her. But we want to thank our panelists who are here. My name is Keith Ellison. I'm co-chair of the Progressive Caucus along with Raúl Grijalva. And the Progressive Caucus is trying to help lead the debate about AUMF and what to do next. It's an important issue that is going to demand a lot of our time and attention, and we want to debate. Therefore, we want to have the best advice we can possibly get. We're very grateful to our panelists today. You know, we need to be fully informed, and we need to know about the consequences of an AUMF, and we need to know about what non-military alternatives are available to confront the real threat that Daesh or ISIL or ISIS might present. The U.S. military has sacrificed much blood and treasure in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last decade, and we need to consider what has come of those wars before authorizing another. And I'm thankful that we could convene discuss the AUMF, the role that diplomacy and humanitarian efforts will play in this particular confrontation in Syria. I also want to just on a personal note, just note that for me, the fight and this conflict and this potential conflict are personal. And they're personal for every single member of Congress, because the most serious thing we ever do is send anyone's family member into harm's way in a conflict. But I happen to have a 20-year-old son who is enlisted active duty military. He's a member of the United States Army, medic, and he's a flight medic, and he's 20 years old. And when people start talking about sending troops in, they're talking about sending my boy in, and I certainly take that quite seriously. So, Jennifer Daskal, who is an assistant professor of law. Professor Daskal is at the University of Washington School of Law in 2013 as assistant professor of law, and she teaches and writes in the fields of criminal law, national security law, constitutional law, and has an excellent background. She's went to a lot of fancy schools like Brown and Harvard and all that kind of stuff. So that's what she's talking about. Anyway, we also have, we're honored to have fellow Phyllis Bennis directs the New Internationalism Project at IPS. She's also a fellow at the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam and has been a writer, analyst, activist on Middle East and UN issues for many years. In 2001, she helped found and remains the advisory board member of the U.S. campaign to end Israeli. She writes and speaks widely across the U.S. and around the world as part of a global peace movement. She continues to serve as an informal advisor to top UN officials in the Middle East and UN democratization issues. She's the author of 8 books, and I'm sure she might share a few of those titles with us. I want to take personal pleasure in inviting some of my own are you still my constituent, Mel? How could you do this to me, Mel? Anyway, Mel Duncan is a co-founder and past executive director of Nonviolent Peaceforce. He's a graduate of Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota, and the Center for Creation-Centered Spirituality in Oakland, California. Mel Duncan has devoted himself to issues of diverse as peace in Central America, living wages, peace conversion of weapons industries, fair reform, nonviolent conflict resolution, and opposition to nuclear waste storage in environmentally and culturally sensitive areas. It's important to note that Mel Duncan's Nonviolent Peaceforce deploys in incredibly dangerous places, including Syria right now, without weapons, and is working to try to promote peace and civic society with the hope of that society regaining stability and peace once again. And we're also very honored to have Mr. William French, who is a policy analyst in the National Security Network. His work focuses on U.S. national security strategy, defense policy, Asian Pacific security affairs, and his writings have been published in Defense News, Huffington Post, National Interest, CNN, and others. And he holds a Master of Arts from the University of Chicago and a Bachelor's of Arts from Monmouth College in Illinois. So with that, why don't you begin us, Professor Daskal.
ISIL. My remarks on the substance and specifics of his proposed authorization. And while the President's effort to engage Congress is certainly a welcome step, it's my position that the proposed authorization falls short in many ways. I'm going to focus my comments on the two most significant flaws in the President's proposal. Here I agree with Congresswoman that the proposal errs in leaving the 2001 AUMF in place. This leads to the perverse effect of expanding rather than limiting the President's authority to. And second, the President's draft authorization includes an overly broad definition of associated forces that could result in an ever-expanding and truly global conflict against terrorism, which is the very thing that the Obama administration has rightly so long decried. Congress now has an opportunity to fix these flaws. Specifically, I think Congress should do three things. First, it should sunset provision to the 2001 AUMF. Second, it should make clear that the ISIL-specific provisions provide the sole source of authority for fighting ISIL, something that Secretary of State John Kerry endorsed in testimony before the Relations Committee last week. And third, to the extent that Congress authorized force against ISIL's so-called associated forces, it should define that term in accordance with recognized principles of co-belligerency and thereby reject the overbroad definition that was offered by the Obama administration in his draft legislation. Around which I'm sure you all know. The past 6 months, the Obama administration has claimed that the 2001 AUMF authorizes the conflict against ISIL. In fact, administration officials reiterated this position in testimony last week before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But the 2001 AUMF, now the longest-running authorization in U.S. history, says nothing about ISIL. It was passed in the days after the September 11th attacks, and it authorizes force against those responsible for those attacks, namely al-Qaeda and the Taliban. ISIL was in no way connected to the 2011 attacks. It did not even exist at the time. And while once connected to al-Qaeda, the groups have formally split, meaning not even qualify as an associated force of al-Qaeda. The Obama administration nonetheless claims that ISIL falls within the 2001 AUMF as a successor to al-Qaeda. So why is this important? It's important because unless the legislation also includes a sunset for the 2001 AUMF, timed to coincide with the sunset for the ISIL-specific AUMF, the ISIL-specific sunset is essentially rendered meaningless. A future administration could simply revert back to the 2001 AUMF as a means of continuing the conflict with ISIL, even if Congress really chose not to reauthorize against ISIL at that point. Put simply, one of the most limits in the administration's draft proposal, the ISIL-specific, has virtually no effect unless it is also coupled with a corresponding sunset for the 2001 AUMF. Now, I just want to be clear about what the effects of sunset provisions are, because I think there's been some confusion about this. A sunset provision is not the same as an end of conflict provision, and it's not intended to end a conflict prematurely if there is a decision at that point that the conflict needs to continue. Further, as Secretary of the Defense Carter testified last week, such sunset provisions stem from the very important principle derived from the Constitution that the grave matter of authorizing armed should be a shared responsibility of the President and of Congress. As Carter put it, albeit in the context of supporting the ISIL-specific, which the administration endorses, sunset provision, quote, affords the American people the chance to assess our programs in 3 years' time and provides the next administration and the next Congress the opportunity to reauthorize it if they find it necessary, unquote. Stated another way, a sunset provision ensures ongoing discussion and ongoing deliberation of what we all know is an evolving conflict, and helps to ensure that conflict, if any, authorized in 2018, matches the nature of the threat at that time. Now, for reasons similar to the need for a 2001 sunset, the legislation also ought to include supersession language, that the ISIL-specific legislation provides a sole source of authority for fighting ISIL. Without such supersession language, the ISIL AUMF simply adds to the authorities provided by the 2001 AUMF, making it largely redundant. Even worse, it opens up the possibility of a future administration turning to the 2001 AUMF as a means of avoiding any restrictions in an ISIL AUMF that it doesn't like. Now, as already stated, the Obama administration has said that it would support such a supersession provision. But also, to be clear, such a provision, while critical, is not an alternative to a sunset provision. They're both essential, and they both serve very different purposes. A supersession provision protects against redundancy. A 2001 AUMF ensures that come 2018, Congress and the American people have a chance to assess whether the conflict should be reauthorized, and if so, whom and for what purposes. Such a sunset is also needed to ensure that, as I've already stated, if and when the ISIL AUMF expires, the administration does not simply revert back to the 2001 AUMF as a means of continuing the conflict in potential contradiction of congressional intent. Now, Congress should also focus its attention on the administration's proposed definition of associated forces. The administration's draft legislation includes the authority to fight both ISIL and its forces and associated persons. The concept of associated forces is not new. It's a concept that's been read into the 2001 AUMF. But the administration's proposed language of associated forces, its definition in the draft ISIL authorization, is significantly broader than what's been used to date in conjunction with the 2000 AUMF. The definition of associated forces employed with respect to the 2001 AUMF has long been limited to those organized armed groups that have entered the fight alongside al-Qaeda against the United States or its coalition partners and operate as a co-belligerent of al-Qaeda. And while there is lots of speculation about what groups are covered, a fact that the administration insists must remain classified and is even withheld from some members of Congress, an analysis of publicly available suggests that only al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula operating in Yemen and possibly al-Shabaab and the al-Khorasan group have been declared associated forces. The number of groups is inherently limited by the criteria that the group has to have joined up with al-Qaeda as a co-belligerent. Now, by comparison, of associated forces included in the president's proposed AUMF for ISIL covers groups and it covers individuals. Not only those who fight for or on behalf of ISIL, but also those who fight alongside the group, as well as successor organizations. And it does not require a finding of co-belligerency. These terms are easily manipulated in the prospect of an ever-expanding conflict. Without clear example, this definition could potentially be relied on to justify the use of force against ISIL copycats or ISIL wannabes. In fact, at the Senate hearing last week before the SFRC, Ash Carter suggested that this is an authority that the administration, in fact, wanted. It wanted potentially the authority to go after ISIL wannabes. But with groups proliferating all around the world expressing support for ISIL and sympathy for ISIL, in some cases motivated by little more than a desire to raise their own profile, this is a dangerous delegation of authority to the executive. It raises the very specter of the very type of global war on terror that the Obama administration has so long and so rightly denounced. If Congress chooses to authorize force against ISIL's associated forces, it should define that term in accordance with the definition used to date with the 2001 AUMF, and it should be explicitly limited to those organized armed groups that actually join ISIL as co-belligerents in hostilities against the United States. And meanwhile, if other organized armed groups emerge the type of sustained grave threat that justify additional uses of force, is not hapless. The president has Article 2 authorities, and the president can and should come back to Congress and seek additional authorizations if and when such authorizations are needed. But there simply is no justification for essentially writing the executive a blank check. Now, I have additional points that I'd also like to make, if there's time, about the authorization, specifically focusing on the need for more robust reporting requirements and compliance with international law, but I will stop now and just say thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Perhaps we can get to them in the Q&A. Ms.
For your work. Within the caucus, I particularly would also like to express my thanks to Congresswoman to stand against the initial vote for the authorization for the use of military force. I want to come to this from a slightly different approach, which is not starting with the AUMF, the question of how to respond to ISIS. And I think it is important alternatives to war, partly because war is not working, and partly because the consequences of war are often worse than the goal that the war was initially fought for. I start from 2 points. One, you can't bomb extremism. You can bomb extremists, and sometimes you'll hit them. You'll almost always hit other people who will get very angry and often become extremists in response, but you can't bomb extremism. You can't use weapons, conventional or otherwise, to destroy extremist ideas. Secondly, I think we have to challenge very specifically the language that President Bush first used, and that I'm afraid is coming back into our discourse, that the only choices we have are to either go to war or to let him get away with it. We were told that explicitly on 12th, 2001. It wasn't true then, and it's true now. So I think that we need to look at other alternatives. We've heard over and over again, there is no military solution, and I think that's absolutely true. What is also true is that the military actions that are taken when there are no military solutions, in most cases, and we're seeing it now, makes things worse, not better. So we need to look at what the alternatives are. What are the ways of responding that will allow a challenge to the damage that an organization as violent as ISIS is doing, making it worse? I have 8 proposals, and I'll go through them very, very briefly. In my written testimony, there's my start from the understanding that ISIS is powerful because a few tens of thousands of fighters are particularly good fighters or particularly well armed, although they are better armed than many in the region, but because they are alone. We have to acknowledge that. They are not an isolated group that everyone in the region wants to defeat. That's a sad reality, given the violence that is at the core of what they stand for. But we have to look at who is supporting them, why, and how, if we are serious about challenging their influence. So to go to the 8 proposals here. Number 1, we start do no harm. And that means not only being committed to the notion of no boots on the ground and recognizing that there are already thousands of boots on the ground, probably another at least hundreds, if not thousands, of sneakers on the ground from the CIA or special forces that are not included in the 3,100 that have been authorized to go back to Iraq, but also the air war. Air war, and maybe Congressman Johnson, this goes to your question of what is war. Air war is war. And the people who are living under that air war are living through a war. That is our war. And they are blaming us as much as anyone else for that war. It's our planes, it's F-16s flown by our pilots. Some of the planes are being flown by pilots from neighboring countries, from U.S. allies, but they are also our planes, trained by our military, dropping bombs produced in this country. So this is already our war. And when we talk about do no harm, I think we have to include ending the air war as well as not moving forward with ground troops. One more point on that, which is we have to look at how dropping bombs is perceived, not here, but where the bombs are falling. So if we look at Iraq in particular, when bombs are dropped, for example, on an ISIS-held Sunni village, people here may cheer and say, yay, we got the bad guys. And maybe we did get some bad guys who we consider bad guys. But how does that appear to Iraqi Sunnis? In many cases, it appears as one more example of the U.S. fighting a war on behalf of the Shia and the Kurds against the Sunnis. Because the result of years of occupation of Iraq have left that country with a social that has been shredded into a kind of sectarianism that goes far beyond anything we have experienced in this country. And it's in that context that people assess what's the meaning of the bombs that are being dropped. Number two, that withdraw the ground troops that are on the ground now and stop trying to create a proxy army in Syria, which does not even exist at this point. When we talk about sending either our troops or training up a new army in Syria, retraining a new army in Iraq, this is what ISIS wants. This is where there is a parallel between ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda wanted U.S. troops in their turf. They wanted to fight on their territory. They wanted to show the world, you see, what we've been saying is right, that the U.S. is invading our holy territory. And ISIS is saying the same thing. So that's number two, withdraw the ground troops and stop trying to create a proxy army. Number three, stop flooding the region with arms. All of the arms that we are sending are in danger of ending up in the hands of ISIS. Some are going almost directly. Many are ending up with other extremists. All are causing enormous civilian. We need to be very vigilant about enforcing the Leahy Law. The Leahy Law is one of the most important laws that make our country something to be. A law that says we will not provide arms to any military unit, any force, any army that is carrying out human rights violations. Now, for some of us, almost all military action includes human rights violations, but we don't have to go that far for members of Congress. What is true is that we know that many of the forces using our weapons, whether they're weapons left behind when the U.S. trained Iraqi army collapsed, whether it's weapons sent to so-called moderates in Syria by our allies, those are our weapons sold by us, but without enforcing our own end-use requirements. This is leading to a region that is filled with arms, most of them ours. And until we stop flooding the region, we have no basis to think we're going to have the effect of arming that side if you're still arming the other side. There needs to be a move towards an arms embargo. That's not going to happen right away, but we need to be moving towards that rather than running away from it, which is really what we're doing. Number four, we need new diplomatic partnerships to deal with ISIS. There is no military solution, so we need to have diplomacy back at center stage. That means engaging with Iran beyond the immediate engagement that is going, as we hope, very well on the nuclear talks. We need to be looking at the kind of grand bargain with Iran that used to be on the agenda when Iran was working closely with the U.S. in the aftermath of 9/11 over how to deal with the Taliban. Many of us don't necessarily agree with the decisions that were made, but the fact that the U.S. was able to deal strategically with the government in Tehran is every indication of why we can do that again, and we need to be. Similarly, we need to be engaging with Russia directly in terms of challenging how the Syrian civil war can be brought to an end. So those particular partnerships need to be on top of our agenda. Number five, we need a much broader diplomatic initiative that's grounded in the leadership of the United Nations. The fact that there have been two initiatives that failed, two special envoys, frustration, does not lead us to say we can walk away. There needs to be serious international diplomacy that aims first at supporting the local ceasefires that the UN is trying to push in Syria, particularly right now around Aleppo and the areas surrounding Aleppo, leading to more diplomacy. That doesn't mean that we're calling for immediate sit-down diplomacy with ISIS. It's crazy right now. But that doesn't mean that we don't have the seek out real diplomacy with those who are supporting ISIS, willingly or unwillingly, those who are arming ISIS, those who are arming those who fight alongside ISIS against the regime in Syria, some of whom are the so-called moderates that have also beheaded prisoners within a week after the horrifying of U.S. prisoners. We saw that from the Free Syrian Army. Number 6, very quickly, we need to push for specific negotiations on Syria that bring everybody to the table, learning the lessons from former Senator George Mitchell, who after the Good Friday Accord said, if you're serious about diplomacy, everybody's at the table. Number 7, we should be considering the reversal of the Holder versus Law Project, which prohibits dealing with local people to teach them about, among other things, mobilization and how to access the United Nations human rights system. And finally, massively increased humanitarian aid for refugee and IDP support in the region. Thank you very much for allowing me this opportunity.
Thank you, ma'am. Mel Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to some experience and some thoughts the authorization of the use of Peaceforce. No matter what we do or don't do, it's important to remember that we're talking about long-term solutions. There are no short-term solutions. There are no military solutions. Thus, we need at this point to apply a standard as to whether or not our proposed actions are moving us towards de-escalation of a and longer-term war, or are moving us towards peaceful initiatives and long-term peace. So I'm here to share some experiences and thoughts about non-military alternatives. One approach that I urge you to support is sending unarmed civilian protectors. For the past 12 years, I have been involved with direct and deploying unarmed civilian protectors to areas of violent conflict, dealing with both state-based terrorism as well as non-state terrorism. Our civilian protectors only go at the invitation of local civil society, employ nonviolent methods to directly protect civilians and deter violence. Our largest project is in South Sudan today, where 150 people from 25 countries are at work in 11 locations. And as Congressman Ellison, we have received a grant from the European Union to begin a civilian protection project in Syria. Peaceforce is one of about 10 non-organizations that are conducting unarmed civilian protection in various parts of the world. This is an emerging methodology for the direct protection of civilians and localized violence prevention. There are a number of field-tested methodologies that have been shown to work in terms of the direct protection answer. Also, it's important to note that the UN has appointed a high-level peace operations review panel that is examining UN operations throughout the world right now, finding that indeed civilians can and do play major roles in protection of civilians. The report is out at the end of May, is due at the end of May, and I urge you to pay attention to this report. Secondly, I ask that you support civil society that is working at this very moment in Iraq and Syria. Let me assure you that there are courageous women and men who are on the ground, who are local, and are working on reconciliation inside those two countries. One group that we work with is led by young women, peace ambassadors in Syria, and peace bridges, and have a network now in excess of 6,000 people going across political and religious lines that are working directly on peace building and reconciliation. There's a project in Aleppo that's happening right now that focuses on young men who are recruited by the various extremist organizations. But instead, these young men are working on constructive programs like building libraries from the rubble for children in Aleppo. Syrian and Iraqi society needs to be supported across political, religious, and geographic divides. That means supporting them whether they are opposed to the government, neutral, or supportive of the government, because they are an essential element in securing a foundation for a sustainable future. Violent extremists have much more difficulty taking hold in where there is a strong civil society and where there is respected local leadership. As Phyllis mentioned, in addition to rescinding the Holder versus Humanitarian law, the State Department should discontinue their policy of vetting all participants in any training they support. I want to be clear, I'm not talking about the Leahy law. I am referring to a process where those providing training, even nonviolent training, have to submit an advanced list of trainees to the State Department. For many of my colleagues, as well as our organization, that is a non-starter. We reject that. Therefore, there is no support from the U.S. State Department for these civil nonviolent efforts. Localized bottom-up have been shown to reduce levels of violence, provide safe havens, and offer access to humanitarian assistance. But they cannot survive alone. There needs to be a combined model that strengthens and supports the local role and integrates that into Track 1 negotiating processes. Localized ceasefires need to be supported by international monitors, and there are models of this work that have taken place in Mindanao in the Philippines and are underway in Myanmar at this moment. National mediators and advisors for civilian protection and violence interruption and reduction need to be provided. Syrian-composed civil protection teams, women's peacekeeping teams, and mediators need to be trained and supported. Localized ceasefires need to be supported by the international community, and there's already precedent for this. During the chemical weapons inspections, needed access, and those precipitated localized ceasefires in places like Karavizica and in Hama. And therefore, there was the political will at that time to support those localized approaches. That political will can happen again. By proposing and supporting—
Excuse me, Mr. Duncan, I hate to do this to you. Unfortunately, members are going to have to leave in a few minutes because that noise you hear is signaling a vote. If you could wrap it up, and then we could go to Mr. French, we might be able to get all of our witnesses in this afternoon. And I do apologize. We don't have any control over when they call votes.
I understand, Mr. Chair. At this point, Congress, the authorization for permanent, as included in the authorization for the use of military force in 2001, will not go away until Congress takes it away. You can see our youth who have a resignation that the country will permanently be at war by not only a authorization. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. French.
Thank you. I'll do the best to abbreviate my remarks so everyone can make it to the votes that they need to make it to. I'm honored to join all to discuss the President's proposed authorization for the use of military force against ISIL. I'd like to outline how a number of key national security relate to considering the President's proposition and what kind of provisions it should and should not ultimately include as a result. I think as all of us know by way of background that ISIL poses a very real national security threat to the United States, but it is precisely the significance of these national security concerns that mean that it is important, in my opinion, that Congress play a role in helping to institute an effective counter-ISIL strategy that uses all elements of American national power, including diplomatic, economic, informational, and military. To that end, a well-crafted and tailored AUMF can serve as a powerful tool to ensure any war authority is tied to an effective and appropriate strategy. The administration's proposal is a step in that direction, but there's a few outstanding issues remaining, not dealing only with the wording of the authorization, but also with the strategy which it would be authorizing. First, the proposal does not include or define the objectives of the armed conflict against ISIL. Specifying those objectives, the next president would be free to perhaps dramatically change the nature of the campaign before consulting Congress. Elsewhere, not in the statutory proposal, officials, including the president, have defined the purpose of the conflict to, quote, degrade and ultimately destroy ISIL. But destroying ISIL poses a significant military and political challenge to which there does not yet appear to be any realistic solutions. Militarily, full destruction of the organization appears unrealistic, given that the United States and coalition forces have not yet destroyed organizations like core al-Qaeda and the Taliban, despite more than a decade war involving sizable ground force operations. While the United States is set to increase its assistance to moderate members of the Syrian opposition, their top priority is fighting the Assad regime, not ISIL. Politically, destroying ISIL requires being able to extend legitimate governance over the territory taken back from the organization. This can perhaps be accomplished in Iraq, where the central government still exists, but it's not clear what the path forward would be in Syria, unless the Syrian civil war is first resolved. And just to be clear, in Syria at present day, there are no political entities, capability, or necessarily the intent to govern the territory and population that ISIL presently controls, and there are no plans to at least that have been shared publicly. Second, very briefly, the proposal of key reporting requirements that could be important to reassessing the conflict. For example, what is the government strategy in detail? What are the metrics of success in the conflict? Are these metrics being met? Are they not? Why? What capabilities and intent does ISIL have to target the American homeland, if any? Third and final, any AUMF will of course be the product of a political process here in Washington. Therefore, it is important to prevent provisions that would be potentially harmful, perhaps disastrous, to American national security from being added. There are many counterproductive provisions that could be added, but one stands out above all others, and by the way, conservative members of Congress have called for making sure that this AUMF gives the president the authority to attack the Assad regime, which constitutes the main opponent of the moderate Syrian opposition. They argue that this is necessary to protect the moderate opposition, who we are assisting. Our strategy on the Syrian side of operations depend. However, granting this and future presidents statutory authority to launch strikes against the regime would open the door to mission creep on the Syrian side of the war. They could expand to U.S. forces being ordered to degrade the Syrian military, ultimately the Assad regime itself. I think it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, that these kinds of operations would be a sizable military undertaking and differ significantly in character, scope, and building activities. This would be a dramatically different war than the one heretofore debated by Congress. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Finch. I know you had much more to say, and we appreciate you trying to stay brief. Let me just do a time check. Do we have a few minutes for a question? About 7 minutes. Could I ask members to allow Ms. Watson-Coleman to lead the questioning? You don't have any? Because you didn't get a chance to make an opening? No. I have so many questions that I didn't hear for. Wow. Okay, well, then that I'll open up in members of their order of arriving here. Hank, I'm not sure if Hank or Jan was here first. Hank, Mr. Jan. I don't have any questions. Any questions? I just want to thank the panelists for coming to share with us. Gives us a lot to think about. Yeah. You want to go?
Well, you know, there's a whole page. Let's see. There we go. Administration contends that the 2001 and 2 Iraq and Afghanistan AUMFs provide legal authority to use military force against ISIL because members of ISIL were once members of a
Its theory is certainly creative, to say the least. The president has defined ISIL as the successor to al-Qaeda, and therefore it brings ISIS within the 2001 AUMF. But what I think is really important here is that the administration's draft legislation would would sanction that type of theory going forward. So the administration's draft legislation, associated forces, I said this already, but it defines associated forces to include successor organizations without any sort of limit or definition of what that means. And what this creates is this risk that all kinds of splinter groups and groups that claim to be following
Boko Haram
ISIS
now
is,
says they're ISIL, don't they?
I'm
Didn't
sorry?
They just say that didn't Boko Haram now says they're ISIL.
right, Boko Haram has purportedly announced to have joined up with ISIL. Or the extent to whether this is aspirational or to the extent that there's really some sort of command and control agreement.
actually-
But there's a real risk of groups around the world claiming the mantle of ISIL
Right.
because it's very attractive in terms of recruiting. And so what happens if you have this very broad definition of associated forces, of force authorized against ISIL and associated forces? It's essentially Congress authorizing the use of force against these emergent groups in places really all over.
Did you want to say? Yeah.
I was just going to add very briefly that there is some precedent to a similar situation in Afghanistan when we had the numbers of Taliban and of Al-Qaeda operatives in Afghanistan, according to the CIA, were down somewhere between 50 and 100 years ago, and yet we kept 100,000 U.S. troops and 40,000 more NATO troops in Afghanistan. Right now, there's a group of what the CIA says is somewhere in the dozens of Afghans who have declared themselves the Afghan branch, which means, is that going to be the basis on which the U.S. keeps troops in Afghanistan much longer, maybe more than 10,000? It raises the notion that any group that wants U.S. to come to their country to prove a political point by declaring themselves somehow connected to ISIS, they're opening that.
We may not be able to, certainly there's a chance of that. So would you all be willing to meet us again and have maybe an informal talk, or maybe we can meet like this? We'll try to hook it up again. But we got to get folks onto the voting floor now. I want to, as a matter of fact, so I just want to say thank you to all of you. You've given us helpful things to think about, and I certainly have plenty of questions myself, but no time for it at the moment. But again, thank you very much on behalf of the Progressive Caucus with you.